This podcast has been produced on the traditional lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples. From 2RPH, this is Passing Thoughts. I'm Rob Kaldor. This is a podcast where we talk openly and honestly about death, dying, and everything in between. We've already received some great feedback on our first couple of episodes. If you haven't had a chance to listen, they're available on all major podcast apps. Don't forget to rate and review Passing Thoughts. It really helps others find the show. Later in this episode, I'll bring you our Before We Go segment, where we explore some of the quirkier and more unexpected aspects of death and dying. Today's story is a special one, featuring the music of someone I really admire, so stick around until the end. But first, this episode is all about how we navigate the healthcare system when death approaches. Connie Mason speaks with Professor Ken Hillman. As well as being an intensive care clinician, Ken is the author of A Good Life to the End. Connie begins by asking him how the experience of witnessing the death of his grandfather compared with the death of his mother affected him.
Most people's grandfathers died at home in a particular time. My younger brother and I were there, and to be quite honest, we were scared stiff because here's my grandfather, there's his body in this bed next to where we were sitting. But on reflection, it was a much better way of dying than my mother. For the last 6 months of her life, she was admitted to hospital 22 times. She kept asking me if only they knew what was wrong with me, Ken, then they'd be able to fix it. And that's, I guess, one of the problems with medicine. It's fixated on a diagnosis. And what was wrong with my mother was accumulation of age-related disorders. So basically, she was dying of old age, but she was totally cognizant, although her body was falling to pieces, basically. It was an awful death. And she didn't want to go into hospital, but there just seemed to be the fallback position for people, no matter how old they were or how close they were to the end of their life. The fallback position was ambulance, emergency department, hospital, and then if they got sick enough, they'd come into the intensive care unit. So compared to my grandfather's death, my mother's death was awful.
So you talked about the fact that your grandfather had a family physician attending to him. And you also talk about other things in the current approach to medicine that don't work well for old people, one of them being the loss of the family physician. What other things are there, Ken, that don't work well for us as we age?
If you're a specialist, and we are now concentrating on specialist medicine, like in 1959, the general practitioner was usually the last port of call. Hospitals at that time, and this isn't that long ago, had very limited options. They didn't have sophisticated anesthesia, intensive care. There was very little surgery. There were very little in the way of antibiotics and sort of diseases such as cancer. There were very limited treatments. And then we started to specialize, and that's excellent. If you've got one particular problem, specialization is great. But the problem is, as one gets older, you've got a multiple amount of problems, and they add up more than the sum of the parts. And so the specialist is specializing so much on their own bit that they're not able to look at the big picture.
And that came home to you very clearly one particular day, and you talk about it in the book as your Groundhog Day.
I think I went on leave for about 2 weeks, and the patients who were in the intensive care unit when I left to go on leave were exactly the same patients who were there when I came back. There wasn't any change. Most of them were near the end of their life, but medicine concentrates on curing and making people better. So the 4 or the 6 years course that one does in medicine to become a doctor, we learn about curing, saving lives, and we rarely talk about death and dying. It's done a little bit with cancer, but it's not emphasized, for example, in the elderly. So the people I saw when I came back, which I call Groundhog Day, were exactly the same. They had no progress at all since I had taken that 2 weeks leave.
And what did you do?
Well, I thought very carefully about the fact of what am I doing as an intensive care clinician? my role was to save lives and make people better. But my role was also increasingly talking to the relatives of these patients, talking to my colleagues about, are we really doing the right thing here? And trying to convince them that medicine has its limitations. And that's a very difficult thing to do in people that are focused on curing, making people better.
The conversations between the doctor, the patient and the family, can you talk to us about the difficulty of having those conversations and how it impacts on the information that we get?
It's a very difficult topic, especially if you're a doctor. And if you're a doctor focused on curing, making people better, then it's very difficult to bring up the topic of death and dying. And it took me quite a while, I guess, to feel comfortable with it. And many of my colleagues still aren't very comfortable with talking about death and dying. They are taught a little bit about cancer, and most of palliative care concentrates on cancer, but it sort of neglects the fact that elderly people are also terminally ill, and many of them in the last 6 months of it, so that by medical definition is being terminally ill. And so it's difficult for doctors and for society generally to talk about terminal illness in an elderly person. If they've got cancer, fine, you can talk about terminal illness and you can say, look, they've got a brain cancer, we've tried everything, nothing can be done and they're dying. But when you're elderly, even though it becomes quite clear towards the end that this person's not going to survive 6 months, it's still very no-go area, basically.
So if I'm looking to take control of my own journey, what do I need to know?
You need to know that if you became suddenly sick, and most elderly people become suddenly sick as a result of infections or falls. Now that's pretty scary. If you're a relative or a friend of an elderly person that has a severe infection or fall, then the first instinct, quite rightly, is to call the ambulance, 000. So the ambulance comes, they've got very little sort of discretionary power. So they take the patient to the emergency department. The emergency department are overwhelmed and they're focused on saving lives, on keeping the person alive. It's not the time to have these complex discussions about end of life. So they have to make a decision about whether they bring them into hospital or not. It's either one or the other. So they often, because there's doubt, they'll bring them into hospital with a fall or full infection. And then they come into a hospital ward. If they then deteriorate even more, then I get a call from a colleague, Ken, I've got a patient down here who's very ill. I've had a chat to them and they want everything done. Now that puts a lot of pressure on me then to talk about death and dying. So my colleagues don't mention death and dying. They say they're very sick. The only hope is to put them on a ventilator and look after them in the intensive care. So if you're a relative at that time and the doctor says to you, look, there's only one hope for this person, and that is send them to intensive care, put trips up, intubate, ventilate, and all that sort of thing. You'd appear to be a very heartless relative if you said, no, let them die.
But what if that information was communicated differently?
When you use the word differently, I think we're referring to earlier, and you need to talk about these things earlier before they have that fall or before they have that serious illness.
So you're saying talk about it with family and with people that might be involved in your care?
Early as possible. And that also is very difficult because it's usually done in the form of a form saying I want this or I don't want that. That doesn't cover the complexity of who the person is and extrapolating from who the person is into what they'd want under certain circumstances. So we're moving to a concept called shared decision making, where instead of just ticking boxes, I don't want CPR, I do want CPR, I don't want to go in hospital, I do want to go in hospital. It's more or less having a more complex discussion about who the person is. First of all, about their general likes and dislikes in life, their priorities in life, and then translating that into, well, what happens if you suddenly became ill? You spend a lot of time learning who the person is first. And then you put to them, for example, if you were demented, would you like to go to hospital if you had a serious illness? Would you like to go to the emergency department? Would you like to be treated at home to a certain degree? Or would you like no treatment at all? So you use a lot of different scenarios to try and cover who the person is, what sort of person this is, and therefore what they'd like under these circumstances.
So you're saying that the medical profession is moving more towards this method of assessing patient needs?
It's more people that are interested in the non-medical approach to dying. And if I could talk about the priorities of elderly people, the 10 most important priorities are not medical. They're things like loneliness, care at home, personal care, shopping. They're not extreme measures in intensive care, or they're not certainly not living longer. That's hardly a priority. The health system is trapped in this conveyor belt. Ambulance, ED, ward, intensive care. And it's hard to pluck people off that conveyor belt.
How, if I'm in that situation, do I communicate my desires to the medical profession? What do I say? Or what questions do I ask?
Yeah, no, that's really hard. There's basically only at the moment things like the Advanced Care Directive. Now, they're fine, but they're tick boxes and they're limited. And if you've got a sudden illness, then the medical profession doesn't like just looking at your advanced care directives when you're seriously ill, because they're not too sure. And so they'll do things to keep you alive. And then they look at the advanced care directive later. It's easy to ignore the advanced care directive because you're focused as a doctor to keep you alive before you know who this person is and what they really want. One could say that, but after you've done this initial resuscitation, then one should be looking at the advanced care directive. You mentioned the groundhog day, but none of this was mentioned to these people over that 2 weeks. And it's also very difficult to get relatives and friends to make the decision. And I think that depends on the way one talks to relatives and friends.
So these are the conversations that we should be having with our relatives and friends so that they're able to help guide the medical profession at the time that it's appropriate.
Yes, like if I have relatives, they care for the person, they love the person. And so if I said, look, shall I continue to treat your loved one or shall I stop? There wouldn't be many who'd say, no, let's stop. So you've got to ease your way into this sort of thing by asking, who is this person? I'd like to know this person because I never got to know them. And now they're on machines. So could you tell me a bit about who they are? Then I usually say things like, especially if they're old, can you tell me what's been happening in the last year or two? And invariably, they use words such as, they've become more frail. I'm more worried about them. They're not able to dress themselves, or they're not able to do this. So they dictate the terms, if you like. So what they're saying to me is they are dying. And then you drift into, well, what do you think they'd like? And that is a very interesting question because invariably they say, well, they wouldn't like to be on a machine in intensive care if they were coming to the end of life. So you let them make this decision rather than saying, shall we turn them off?
Yes. So that's a good question to keep in mind. What would the person that you're caring for like?
Exactly.
As I age, what should I be asking myself? What sort of questions in terms of should I be planning a high level of care or what is available? Are those the sorts of things that are important to ponder?
If you were becoming demented, would you like full treatment or would you like no treatment or would you like something in between? To go through these scenarios, like if I've got severe pain and it can't be treated anymore, if I'm bedbound, if I'm chairbound, one sort of uses these scenarios in order to say, under those circumstances, what would you like? So if you're able to conduct your activities of normal living, for example, that's fine. You get really sick, well, it's fine to be treated actively. But to put scenarios about how bad your health is what would you like under those circumstances, I think is much better.
So as well as the conversations that we need to have, there are other ways to communicate this, and one would be an advanced care plan. And also, could you talk to us about a manifesto which you mentioned in your book, Ken?
It was my wife's sister who had a terminal disease, motor neurone disease. And the last time I saw her in the States, because she lived in the States, she was coming to the end. She could still speak, but she couldn't get around by herself. So I said, look, if ever you want me to come over and chat to you, I will. So she rang me one day and said, would I come over and chat to her and her husband? So I sat with them and we constructed this manifesto. And it said that no tracheostomies, I don't want to go into hospital, I don't want this, but I do want this, but I don't want this, I don't want that. So I had all these things worked out and 4 or 5 pages. And then I thought my role was to protect her from the American health system, which I didn't trust. It's sort of driven a lot by cost and profit, etc. And so we went to her family practitioner and I said, look, we've had long discussions. These are the things that Denise wants and these are the things that she doesn't want. And she said, I've got just a thing for you. And it's called hospice care. And I said, no, she doesn't want hospice care. And I thought hospice care was going into a hospice, but it wasn't. It's a name for a system in America for people that have got less than 6 months to live, where they get total treatment at home. And I mean total treatment. So this is nursing care every day. And there's only 2 nurses, so it's always someone they know. It was social work, occupational therapy, and a music therapist. And believe it or not, the music therapist played the harp, which is probably a bit inappropriate for someone near the end of life, but there you go. So we said, this is perfect, this is what we want. So the next day, Becky arrived. She was honest and straightforward. Denise, I know you're dying, and I'm here to help you. I read your manifesto, and we're going to go by exactly what you want, and I'll be here every day to make sure it happens. And sure enough, for the next 3 months, she had a nurse come every day. She had these other people coming as well, intermittently, including the music therapist. And it was the best death, the Rolls Royce of death, in America of all places.
And what do you attribute that to? Clarity about what she wanted in the end?
Clarity, but the reason why they have hospice care in America, it's cheap. It is cheaper to provide that excellent care than it is to go into a hospital and take up a bed. $5,000 per patient per day in Australia for an intensive care bed.
Assessing our end of life, and the word frailty came up, Ken. And I believe that that's a fairly good measure. Can you explain that?
Yes. Look, I like this word frailty because it's used by society. If I'm talking to relatives who've got sick people in the intensive care unit, they often use the word frailty themselves. They say they're getting more frail. And we're beginning to put numbers on this frailty. And these numbers are fairly accurate. Now, it's always difficult to predict how long people have got to live. Even if you have a terminal brain cancer and you tried every form of treatment and they say, well, how long have I got to live? It's still a guess. It's still uncertain. But the word frailty and the numbers we assign to frailty is a fairly reasonable way of predicting how long this person would live. So the Queen, for example, the Queen would come out on the balcony and wave to her subjects. And I could see that her frailty scores were going up and up. So they were going 5, 6, 7. And then towards the end, she was extremely frail. And she died a few days later. Now, interestingly enough, the Queen was allowed to die of old age. It was written on her death certificate. You're not allowed to die of old age in Australia. You've got to make up something. So we usually make up cardiovascular failure because if your heart stops, you die, which means that a lot of people are said to die of cardiovascular failure in Australia, whereas in fact it's not really cardiovascular failure. It's old age. It's all the organs are falling to pieces, but there's no single word for this.
So why can't we write that we've died of old age?
It would be marvellous if we're still allowed to use words like old age, death, dying, that they're words that we avoid at the moment.
So it's pretty fair to say that your grandfather would have had difficulty having the kind of death that he experienced if he was in today's healthcare system.
Oh, it'd be hopeless. He'd go to the emergency department, he'd be admitted under one specialist, but he'd also have many other problems. So the one specialist would ask another specialist colleague to come and look at them, and then they'd ask another specialist. So you get this committee approach to old age, where you have a lot of different specialists working on their own little bits, but their own little bits are very old and very frail.
So what do you think needs to change in our healthcare system?
We need to try to identify prognosis in old people. I think that would be a good start. Now, these would be flags. It's not to saying you only have 6 months to live, but there are certain things like frailty which would be a flag. And when you have this flag, then you're seen by somebody, and I think the best person is the family practitioner, the general practitioner, who should be paid the right amount of money for doing the complex discussions. At the moment, that's not possible. It's only 5, 10 minute, 15 minute sort of conversation. And these are complex areas. And so once you're flagged as someone towards the end of life, going to the general practitioner who would then use an advanced care directive or some more complex form of advanced care directive, who would be controlling that end of life, so that if they want to die at home, and 80% of elderly people do want to die at home, it could be the general practitioner who can organise all of the various support mechanisms so that they're not admitted to the hospital as the fallback position.
And Ken, where do you think voluntary assisted dying fits into this scenario?
If one has a life-limiting disease such as cancer, that's straightforward. If you've got less than 6 months to live, then you're allowed to go through that very strict voluntary assisted dying. Unfortunately, with the elderly, even if we could, with some uncertainty, predict that they've got less than 6 months to live, we don't allow them access to voluntary assisted dying. I actually believe that we should discuss this more.
Is there anything that you'd like to do in life before your time on Earth ends?
There are a lot of personal things which are related to my family. My professional goals, I'd really like to be involved in a systematic look at the way that we manage death and dying in the elderly. I'd really like to be involved in that. And we've done a lot of research in the area. We've done a lot of thinking in the area. We've spoken to a lot of people in the area. And I'm not saying I'd be the one that would govern this, but I would like to be part of that solution.
It's a very worthwhile goal.
A big thank you to Professor Ken Hillman for joining us on Passing Thoughts. I thought he handled this difficult topic with great insight and care. Thanks also to Connie Mason, our contributor for this episode. You'll be hearing a lot more from her in future episodes. And just a reminder, we'd love to hear from you. If you have feedback, topic suggestions, or want to share your own experience, email us at passingthoughts@2rph.org.au. You can also find us via the 2RPH website or on Facebook. Passing Thoughts is made with the support of the Wicking Trust and the team from 2RPH. A big thanks to Marty, Veronica and Station Manager Barry. In our next episode, Barbara Sullivan speaks with the Reverend Bill Cruz about what happens when you have no money and die.
What really touched me was the hundreds of women, like literally hundreds, who were looking for their dad. And I thought, the world is full of this. So giving somebody a decent burial is part of honouring that.
Before we go, I was recently saddened by the passing of legendary satirist and mathematician Tom Lehrer.
So don't wait up for me, but while you swelter down there in your shelter, you can watch me on your TV.
I had always enjoyed his dark gallows humour. Common themes of his songs included race relations, imminent war, Armageddon, and of course death.
To miss a minute of the agonizing Holocaust, yeah! First
His repertoire of witty songs was incredibly funny and whimsical, but also relevant now.
The balance of power is maintained that way. Who's next? France got the bomb, but don't you grieve, 'cause they're on our side, I believe. China got the bomb, but have no fears. They can't wipe us out for at least 5 years. Who's next?
Before he died, Lehrer did something pretty rare in this world of commercial realities. He made all of his songs and music available free to the public. There is no copyright attached to his music.
The Puerto Ricans, 'cause it's very chic. Step up and shake the hand of someone you can't stand. You can tolerate him if you try.
So to end this episode of Passing Thoughts, enjoy We Will All Go Together When We Go. Rest in peace, Tom Lehrer.
When you attend a funeral, it is sad to think that sooner or later those you love will do the same for you. And you may have thought it tragic, not to mention other adjectives, to think of all the weeping they will do. But don't you worry, no more ashes, no more sackcloth, and an armband made of black cloth will someday nevermore adorn a sleeve. For if the bomb that drops on you gets your friends and neighbors too, there'll be nobody left behind to grieve, and we will all go together when we go. What a comforting fact that is to know. Universal bereavement, an inspiring achievement. Yes, we all will go together when we go. We will all go together when we go, all suffused with an incandescent glow. No one will have the endurance to collect on his insurance. Lloyds of London will be loaded when they go. We will all fry together when we fry. We'll be French fried potatoes by and by. There will be no more misery when the world is our rotisserie. Yes, we all will fry together when we fry. We will all bake together when we bake. There'll be nobody present at the wake. With complete participation in that grand incineration, nearly 3 billion hunks of well-done steak. We will all char together when we char, and let there be no moaning of the bar. Just sing out a Te Deum when you see that ICBM, and the party will be come as you are. We will all burn together when we burn. There'll be no need to stand and wait your turn. When it's time for the fallout and St. Peter calls us all out, we'll just drop our agendas and adjourn. We will all go together when we go, every Hottentot and every Eskimo. When the air becomes Uranus, we will all go simultaneous. Yes, we all will go together when we all go together. Yes, we all will go together when we go.
This is a Radio 2 RPH production.